welcome to episode 7 of Denise and Galen Go to Korea.
Yes, and today's episode is about exploring the different goos and dongs of Seoul, which are the boroughs and neighborhoods. And Denise knows the facts.
There are 25 gu, and like we live in Nowon-gu. And within the 25 gus, there are 426 dongs, D-O-N-G, and those are the actual neighborhoods. These are also related to their political representation as well.
Yeah, and the exploration really ends up being about these little neighborhoods. So I think for a lot of people, before coming to Seoul, if you see it from a distance at all, and some of the kind of media version of it, it seems like a 21st century Blade Runner-y kind of place. And there's a way in which it certainly does look like that. A lot of the new architecture, especially in the wealthier neighborhoods that have been developed more recently, has that, in the best possible sense, Blade Runner-y feel of fluorescent lighting and new architecture, maybe without the terrorists and robots.
But very cool.
But very cool
and very tall.
Yeah, and you know, in some of the experiences we had just coming out of a subway and finding ourselves beneath an amazing new skyscraper, it definitely has a different feel from San Francisco or New York, just in terms of the architecture and maybe the glaringness of the whole experience of these brand new 21st century types high rises, some of which of course are corporate, but a lot of which are super duper nice apartment buildings. Yesterday we went to a concert and we're sitting beneath a really nice looking apartment building with what looked like an amazing penthouse on top. Denise did a little research to see that we probably couldn't afford to move there.
12 million.
For the passions that bring life, left you hard and happy, are the passions that kill life, let you fall to hell. So as softly as in the evening sunset, the thought that gave you glory will take it all the way.
We've mentioned how on the bottom 2 floors of our building there's all these restaurants and services and hair salons and fast food places and stuff. And the fancy places also have those, but on their bottom 2 floors they have like really high-end, expensive bakeries and coffee shops and fancy restaurants.
It definitely has the feel of a fancy neighborhood.
Yeah, not instead of our mom and pop making us a gimbap to go.
Yeah. So we like our vibe way out here in Nowon-gu, which is kind of the furthest out borough, one of the furthest out boroughs. On our map you can see that it's a bit of a ways to a lot of the kind of cultural stuff that's in the center of Seoul. We joke with each other that it's going to take us an hour to get there no matter where we're trying to go to from here. But it's usually perfectly fine ride on the subway into town, and we come out somewhere different each time, led by often our friend Nick, and find ourselves in these really cool areas. But another part of the whole experience has been, as we said, these little neighborhoods. And so this has been the real revelation for us, because there's just endless numbers of these little gus neighborhoods where the vibe and feel is completely different.
Small little alleys that are lined with little mom and pop kind of style restaurants, or maybe bigger fancy alleys that you've seen. If you have any Instagram on Seoul, you'll see all the fancy kids dancing in the street and eating the big ice creams and all the street food. So those are all the different kinds of
Yeah, it's kind of arty neighborhoods that have lots of galleries, jazz clubs, music clubs, clubs that won't let us in because we're way too old.
Way too old.
And every different possible kind of restaurant. And they have kind of a feel of an older Asian city, and the street markets and the night markets have an entirely different feel, and you can walk from one part of town to the other and go from what feels like probably would have been plenty of the 20th century when there wasn't a war going on here, to this completely new, ahead of most US cities vibes.
And there's definitely some styling going on around here. There's a lot of fashion, a lot of fancy people. And then there's a whole bunch of people who, like us, ride the subway and just do their own thing.
Yeah, you kind of get that feel coming back to our part of town. It's definitely not a tourist area at all, and when we get on the subway and end up out here, we're usually the only foreigners that are on the subway. But when you go into town, you find the tourist highlights and find people from different parts of the world there. And there's always these kinds of transitions, even with just a few blocks, to an entirely different vibe.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I like about living way out here in Nowan is that we are basically, the teachers in our building are basically the only foreigners we ever see. So it's definitely that we're living in Korea and we're living in Seoul and we're among the people who are the working class living here as well.
So that's what we got for this week. Galen's probably going to append a teacher musing again. Thanks a lot for checking in, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye. So it's the next day, so I'm wearing a different shirt, and I'm going to muse a little bit about grades sitting here in my classroom. Grades are a big deal. Teachers spend a lot of time thinking about grades, calculating grades, discussing grades with colleagues, creating rubrics, setting standards, and if you're an English teacher, a bajillion hours grading student work in addition to giving feedback. And all of us understand the tensions between teaching students to do something well and giving them a score on how well they did it. And I think most teachers feel that although in theory that score could be helpful to the student in giving them a sense of where they are relative to some kind of standard, more often than not the score becomes a personal judgment that students feel pretty strongly about and distracts very much from the instructional process. And now that I'm teaching in a different school, I'm having to think through not my basic ideas about grades, although I guess to some extent I have to, because although this is a high school with students doing English language arts work that I'm very familiar with, and I can read their work, whether it's a response to the reading we've done or a little group project that they've completed or an essay or other kind of writing that they've done. There's that subjective decision, not so much about whether it's great or good or okay or not so good, but what that means in terms of a grade. And although lots of people, including almost every student I've ever had, thinks that English grades are some kind of subjective personal judgment, they really aren't. I think in my experience, good teachers will have very consistently objective assessments of the quality of students' work and agree almost all the time on what's excellent or good or not so good. When it turns into deciding what that means as a letter grade, that's just a value judgment, like it needs to be this good to get an A. And here, I think students come in maybe because it's Korea, maybe because it's a private school, maybe because it's a particular school, maybe this is just normal, with a different subjective norm about that. And I'm happy to adjust to a different culture around this, because I think the most important thing is to be consistent with my colleagues so that everybody's functioning according to the same subjective standards about what is excellent or good or okay. But it's a difficult conversation to have, because the truth is, although we English teachers, and I think this is more or less equally true in other disciplines in high school, can have an objective agreement about whether this particular sample of a student's work is excellent or good or whatever, all this other stuff gets mixed into people's real sense of grades. And it's not easy to have a conversation at one extreme where all they are supposed to be a purely objective assessment of student performance relative to learning goals, a tool to motivate kids to try harder, which seems to be a pretty big factor here, which is only secondarily related to how good their actual work is, because if you're telling a student, the grade I'm giving you, at least implicitly, is intended not to tell you objectively how well you did, but whether or not I think I can manipulate it to try harder. That's a different kind of set of standards and very common, I think. But it divorces the grade from the assessment of work to kind of a judgment about the kid's work ethic. And having had a lot of conversations about this question, I feel like this is one of those hugely deep and important cultural questions that seems simple and straightforward, like letter grades. We've been doing that since forever, and 85% is a B and 87% is a B plus. And when people haven't really thought this through much and have just kind of accepted a reality, a cultural reality about what this all means, lots of important elements of what the learning experience is supposed to be about get masked. And with kids, both at Los Altos and here, who are super duper focused on how those grades are going to affect their presumed future, there's lots of tension around something that seems like it ought to be settled science, and it's very not. And I've now been giving grades on student work, and I haven't seen any grade distributions or anything like that to get a sense of where this fits into reality. It ends up being a very kind of personal thing too with students, and it's as much as I would like to have them understand that how I feel about them as human beings, and I love them all, separate from whether or not this thing they wrote is a B. It makes life super complicated. You all know this, and I'm thinking through it now. Grades are due soon, and in building the relationships with all these students from this other culture in a world that is one I'm not fully adapted to or used to yet, it kind of is a macro and micro example of the challenges that we all face in trying to figure out how do we help kids learn and grow and do better, do stuff better, and do it within a culture where there's lots of big questions that aren't really addressed or understood or just kind of assumed to be answered, when in fact I don't think they are really at all. That's it for today. Might get a little bonus teacher episode because Denise has been actually teaching. She doesn't want to admit it, but she volunteered to be a sub, and she's getting paid to do this for the first time in her entire life, and I think she's having fun. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Oh boy, I'm excited because I get to do my own teacher talk since I've been substituting in the 5th grade classroom for the week. The 5th graders are cool. They're great. They're pre-hormonal here, and they are smart enough that you can have conversations with them. Every morning we gather on the rug and have a community time, and for the first day I told them they could each ask me a personal question if they wanted to know something about me. And of course they wanted to know, how old I was, and where I lived, and the worst day of my life and the best day of my life. And then someone wanted to know my deepest, darkest secret. So I decided to confess to them that I had not graduated from college, which did get a, how can you be a teacher? And I reminded them that I'm not actually a teacher. I'm just subbing for a real teacher. 5th grade math is easy enough to do, but really hard to teach. And the other subjects are more comfortable for me. I especially enjoy reading aloud to them and then discussing what we've read, and facilitating their book clubs, which they're currently involved in right now. It's been fun, and I will be very happy when Ilan comes back and I go back to being the volunteer.